What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses finds herself in a verbal showdown that nobody saw coming? The kind of confrontation that starts with polite smiles and ends with an empty chair. This is exactly what unfolded when Julia Roberts sat down on The View. And what began as a standard promotional appearance quickly spiraled into something far more explosive. Before we get into this, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling us what you think about what went down. Now, let's dive into how this all started. The segment opened like any other. The panel was assembled, the audience was warmed up, and Julia Roberts walked out to enthusiastic applause. She settled into her seat with that trademark smile, ready to discuss her latest project. The energy in the studio felt standard, routine even. Nobody in that room could have predicted what was about to unfold over the next several minutes. Joy Behar kicked things off with what seemed like a straightforward question about Julia's new film, a drama centered around a journalist uncovering corporate corruption. It was the kind of role Julia had been drawn to lately. Stories with substance, with something to say about the world we live in. She spoke passionately about why the project mattered to her, about the responsibility of storytelling in times like these. That's when Joy interjected with a question that shifted the entire tone of the conversation. She asked Julia about a comment the actress had made in a magazine interview weeks earlier. Something about artists needing to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. Joy wanted to know what Julia meant by that, specifically whether she thought celebrities had a responsibility to be political. Julia's expression changed slightly, not quite guarded but more measured. She explained that she believed artists have platforms, and with those platforms come opportunities to shine light on important issues. She wasn't saying everyone had to be an activist, but that staying silent when you have a voice felt like a choice in itself. Joy nodded along, but there was something in her follow-up that suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with that answer. She pressed further, asking if Julia thought that perspective was naive, given how divisive political discourse had become. She pointed out that many people just want to be entertained, but they come to movies and television to escape, not to be lectured. The air in the studio shifted. You could feel it. Julia sat up a little straighter, her smile now more fixed than genuine. She responded by saying she didn't think it was naive at all. She said that the idea that art and politics are separate has never really been true, that stories have always reflected the times they're created in, and that pretending otherwise is what's actually naive. The other co-hosts exchanged glances. This wasn't the light, breezy conversation they'd planned for. The audience was quiet now, sensing that something unexpected was happening. Joy wasn't backing down. She came back with another question, this time with a slight edge to her voice. She asked Julia if she thought actors who don't speak out on political issues are complicit in the problems facing society. It was a loaded question, one that seemed designed to corner Julia into either alienating her peers or walking back her earlier statements. Julia took a breath before responding. She said she never said anyone was complicit, that she was simply talking about her own choices and her own conscience. She emphasized that every person has to decide for themselves what they're comfortable with, but that for her personally, silence wasn't an option anymore. That's when Joy made a comment that really seemed to strike a nerve. She suggested that it's easy for someone like Julia, someone who's already achieved everything in her career, to take moral stances without worrying about the consequences. She implied that Julia's position came from a place of privilege, that not everyone has the luxury of potentially alienating half their audience. The tension was now unmistakable. Julia's jaw tightened. She responded by saying that assuming she doesn't understand consequences or risk is pretty presumptuous. She pointed out that she's been in this industry for decades and has seen plenty of people pay prices for speaking their minds, herself included. She said that dismissing someone's principles as privilege is a convenient way to avoid engaging with the actual substance of what they're saying. Joy fired back, saying she wasn't dismissing anything, that she was simply pointing out reality. She said that in her experience, people who talk the loudest about principles are often the ones who've never really had to sacrifice anything meaningful for them. That comment landed like a bomb. The other hosts looked uncomfortable now, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let this play out. The audience was completely silent, watching this unfold with a mixture of shock and fascination. Julia's voice was steady, but you could hear the anger underneath it. She said that Joy didn't know anything about what she'd sacrificed or what she'd walked away from, or what opportunities she'd turned down because they didn't align with her values. She said it was incredibly condescending to assume that someone's convictions must be shallow just because they've been successful. Joy responded by saying she wasn't trying to be condescending, that she was just asking questions, doing her job as a host. She said that if Julia was going to make bold statements in public, she should be prepared to defend them when challenged. Julia shot back that there's a difference between challenging someone's ideas and attacking their character. She said that Joy had spent the last several minutes not engaging with her actual points, but instead questioning her motives and her authenticity. She asked Joy directly if she actually wanted to have a conversation about art and responsibility, or if she just wanted to score points by making a guest look bad. The studio was incredibly tense now. Whoopi Goldberg started to say something, clearly trying to defuse the situation, but Joy spoke over her. She told Julia that if she couldn't handle being questioned, maybe she should stick to talk shows that only ask softball questions. She said that The View has always been about real conversation, not promotional puff pieces. Julia's response was sharp and immediate. She said she'd done hundreds of interviews, that she had no problem being questioned, but that what was happening here wasn't a genuine conversation. She said Joy had been hostile from the moment the topic turned serious, that she'd been looking for a fight, not a dialogue. Joy denied this, saying she was simply doing what she always does, pushing back on statements she finds questionable. She said that Julia seemed to want to make grand pronouncements without being held accountable for them. Julia stood up, not dramatically, not throwing anything or making a scene, but deliberately. She said she wasn't going to sit there and be insulted under the guise of tough questioning. She said there's a difference between holding someone accountable and being disrespectful, and that Joy had crossed that line several minutes ago. The other hosts were frozen, clearly unsure how to respond. Joy told Julia she was being overset with that. If she couldn't handle this conversation, then maybe her convictions weren't as strong as she claimed. That was the final straw. Julia looked directly at Joy and said, very calmly, that she was done. Not done with the conversation, done with the show. She thanked the other hosts, nodded to the audience, and walked off the set. The camera stayed on the stunned panel. Joy looked defiant, but you could see something flicker across her face, maybe surprised that Julia had actually left. The other hosts scrambled to fill the sudden void, trying to go to commercial, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the damage was done. In a matter of minutes, what should have been a routine interview had exploded into one of the most uncomfortable moments in the show's history. And it was all captured on camera, every word, every expression, every moment of escalating tension that led to Julia Roberts walking away. The commercial break couldn't have felt longer for anyone in that studio. When they came back, the energy was completely different. The producers had clearly made a decision during the break, and that decision was to address what had just happened head-on rather than pretend it didn't occur. Whoopi Goldberg took the lead, her voice measured and careful. She acknowledged that viewers had just witnessed something unexpected, that emotions had run high, and that sometimes these things happen when people are passionate about their beliefs. She was diplomatic, not placing blame on anyone specifically, but making it clear that the situation had escalated beyond what anyone intended. Joy, however, seemed less interested in diplomacy. She jumped in almost immediately, saying she didn't think she'd done anything wrong. She insisted that her job was to ask tough questions, and that if Julia couldn't handle being challenged, that wasn't on her. She said she'd been doing this for years and had interviewed countless celebrities, and that this was simply what real journalism looks like. Sunny Hostin spoke up, and there was a clear note of disagreement in her voice. She said that while asking challenging questions is absolutely part of the job, there's a way to do it that's respectful. She suggested that the conversation had veered from challenging into combative, and that maybe everyone could have handled things differently. Joy bristled at that. She asked Sunny directly if she thought Julia had been in the right to just walk off. She said that walking away from a conversation because you don't like the questions being asked is privileged behavior, that most people don't get to just leave when things get uncomfortable. Alyssa Farah Griffin chimed in, pointing out that Julia hadn't walked away because things got uncomfortable. She'd walked away because she felt disrespected. She said there's a difference between a tough interview and a hostile one, and that from where she was sitting, it had definitely crossed into hostile territory. The audience was riveted. This wasn't the usual back and forth where the hosts might disagree on a political issue but remain collegial. This was the panel clearly divided on what had just transpired, and that division was playing out in real time on air. Joy defended herself more forcefully now. She said she'd asked Julia about statements the actress had made publicly, that she'd questioned whether those statements held up under scrutiny. She insisted she hadn't attacked Julia personally, that she'd engaged with her ideas. She said that if Julia's ideas couldn't withstand basic pushback, maybe they weren't as solid as Julia thought. Whoopi tried to regain control of the conversation, suggesting they move on to the next segment, but Joy wasn't ready to let it go. She continued, saying that celebrities have gotten too comfortable being treated with kid gloves, that they're used to promotional tours where every interviewer just nods along and agrees with everything they say. She said The View has never been that kind of show, and she wasn't going to start now. Sarah Ann spoke up, and her voice was gentle but firm. She said she understood Joy's point about asking tough questions, but that she'd also felt uncomfortable watching the exchange. She said it seemed like Joy had been trying to prove a point rather than actually engage with what Julia was saying. She noted that several times Julia had attempted to have a substantive conversation about art and responsibility, and each time Joy had redirected it to something more personal or accusatory. Joy's face flushed. She said she was surprised that her own co-hosts were taking the side of someone who'd just disrespected them all by walking off their show. She said Julia had made a choice to leave rather than continue the conversation, and that spoke volumes about her character. That's when Sunny cut in more sharply. She said that, framing it as Julia disrespecting all of them, wasn't accurate. She said Julia had specifically thanked the other hosts before leaving, that she'd made it clear her issue was with Joy, not with the show as a whole. She said trying to make the rest of the panel feel attacked by Julia's departure was manipulative. The tension between the hosts now was almost as thick as it had been during the Julia interview. You could see the audience members glancing at each other, clearly shocked that this was continuing to unfold, that it wasn't being smoothed over with jokes or subject changes. Alyssa added that she thought Joy was missing the larger point. She said that Julia hadn't objected to being questioned about her beliefs. What she'd objected to was having her motives questioned, her authenticity questioned, her life experience dismissed. She said those are very different things, and conflating them was either disingenuous or showed a lack of self-awareness about how the conversation had actually gone. Joy's voice rose. She said she was shocked that after years of working together, her colleagues were publicly criticizing her on air. She said if they had a problem with how she conducted the interview, they should have brought it up during the commercial break, not in front of millions of viewers. Whoopi firmly interjected that Joy had brought this conversation into the public sphere by refusing to drop it. When they came back from commercial, she said Joy had chosen to continue defending herself on air, so the response was naturally going to be on air as well. She said they could either discuss it now or move on, but Joy had to make a choice. For a moment, it seemed like Joy might actually let it go, but then she circled back, saying she wanted viewers to understand that she'd done nothing wrong. She reiterated that challenging powerful people is her job, that holding celebrities accountable for their statements is important work, and that she refused to apologize for doing it. Sunny responded by saying no one was asking her to apologize for asking tough questions. They were suggesting she reflect on how she asked them. She said the difference between a good interviewer and a combative one is that a good interviewer listens to the answers they receive and responds to those, while a combative interviewer already has their narrative decided and just attacks anything that doesn't fit it. Joy shot back that it was rich to be lectured about interview technique by people who hadn't been doing this as long as she had. She said she'd earned her place at this table through decades of work, and she wasn't going to be second-guessed by her co-hosts on live television. The atmosphere was now openly contentious. Alyssa said that experience doesn't make someone immune from criticism, that longevity doesn't automatically mean you're right. She said plenty of people with long careers have blind spots, and maybe this was one of Joy's. Joy asked if Alyssa was seriously comparing her to journalists who'd fallen from grace or lost their credibility. Alyssa clarified that she wasn't, that she was simply saying everyone can improve, everyone can learn, and that dismissing feedback because of how long you've been doing something is the opposite of growth. Sarah tried to bring some levity to the situation, making a gentle joke about how this segment had taken an unexpected turn, but it fell flat. The damage was too deep, the divisions too clear. Whoopi made an executive decision. She said they were going to take another commercial break, and when they came back, they were moving on to a completely different topic. She said this firmly, in a way that left no room for argument. Joy looked like she wanted to protest, but even she could see that continuing this on air was only making things worse. As they cut to commercial, you could see the hosts' expressions. Joy looked angry and defiant. Sunny and Alyssa looked frustrated. Sarah looked uncomfortable. Whoopi looked exhausted. This wasn't just about an interview gone wrong anymore. This had exposed real fractures in the panel's dynamic, disagreements that clearly went beyond this one incident. When they returned from the break, they did manage to move on to other topics, but the energy never fully recovered. The usual banter felt forced. The moments of agreement felt performative. Everyone watching could tell that something fundamental had shifted, that this wasn't a blip that would be forgotten. This was a moment that would define how people saw the show and its hosts moving forward. Social media had already exploded. Clips of both Julia walking off and the subsequent panel disagreement were spreading rapidly. People were taking sides, debating who was right, who was wrong, whether Joy had crossed a line or Julia had been too sensitive. The conversation had moved far beyond the studio walls. The show continued for another segment, but it was clear that everyone's mind was still on what had transpired. They discussed a lighter topic, something about upcoming holiday trends, but the enthusiasm was manufactured. The hosts were going through the motions, hitting their marks, but the spark that usually made the view engaging was completely absent. What made it even more uncomfortable was that Joy kept trying to insert comments that seemed designed to justify her earlier behavior. During a discussion about consumer trends, she made a pointed remark about how people these days can't handle any criticism, how everyone expects to be coddled. It was ostensibly about shoppers and customer service, but everyone knew what she was really talking about. Sunny gave her a look, but didn't take the bait. Alyssa changed the subject smoothly, refusing to let Joy drag them back into the controversy. But Joy tried again a few minutes later, making another comment about how some people think they're above being questioned just because they're successful. This time, Whoopi cut her off mid-sentence. transitioning to the next topic with a firmness that made it clear she was done with Joy's passive-aggressive attempts to relitigate the situation. The show finally ended, and you could feel the relief through the screen. The hosts did their usual closing, thanking viewers for watching, but there was none of the warmth or camaraderie that typically characterized their spin-offs. They felt like co-workers who couldn't wait to get away from each other, not a panel of friends who'd just spent an hour together. But the real story was just beginning. Within hours, the clips had millions of views. News outlets were covering it as a major entertainment story. Think pieces were being written about celebrity interviews, about the role of political discourse in entertainment media, about where the line is between challenging, questioning, and hostile confrontation. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some people defended Joy, arguing that she'd done exactly what a journalist should do, that she'd refused to let a celebrity hide behind vague platitudes about art and activism. They said Julia had proven she couldn't defend her positions when genuinely challenged, that walking off was an admission that her convictions were shallow. They praised Joy for not backing down, for treating Julia like any other interview subject rather than with the deference usually afforded to A-list stars. Others came down firmly on Julia's side. They argued that Joy had been unnecessarily aggressive from the start, that she'd approached the interview with a predetermined conclusion and had simply tried to bully Julia into either conforming to it or looking bad. They pointed out that Julia had attempted multiple times to have a substantive conversation, and that Joy had consistently redirected to personal attacks disguised as questions. They said Julia had every right to walk away from a situation where she was being disrespected, that staying would have only validated Joy's behavior. Then there was a third group, perhaps the most interesting, who argued that both women had valid points but had handled the situation poorly. They suggested that Joy's questions weren't inherently unfair, but that her delivery had been needlessly combative. They also suggested that Julia, while justified in being frustrated, had perhaps been too quick to leave, that engaging further might have actually proven her point better than walking away did. Celebrity reactions started rolling in. Some of Julia's friends and colleagues posted supportive messages on social media, praising her for standing up for herself and refusing to tolerate disrespect. A few other actors shared their own stories of interviews that had crossed the line from challenging to hostile, validating Julia's perspective. Interestingly, several journalists and media personalities defended Joy, arguing that the entertainment industry has become so protective of celebrities that any real questioning is viewed as an attack. They said that if Julia wanted to make political statements, she needed to be prepared for political pushback, and that crying disrespect when challenged was a way of avoiding accountability. The views, ratings for the next episode were through the roof. Everyone tuned in to see if the hosts would address it further, if there would be an apology, if the tension would still be visible. The show opened with Whoopi making a brief statement. She acknowledged that the previous episode had generated significant conversation, that emotions had run high on all sides, and that sometimes these things happen when people care deeply about their perspectives. She said they appreciated all viewpoints, and that they were moving forward. It was carefully worded, acknowledging the incident without assigning blame or offering apologies. Joy sat there looking vindicated, as if the statement confirmed she'd been right all along. The other hosts looked less certain, but they followed Whoopi's lead and moved on to the day's topics. But moving on proved harder than expected. For the next several shows, the dynamic between the hosts was noticeably different. Joy seemed more defensive, quicker to argue her points, more insistent on being right. The others seemed more cautious around her, less willing to engage in the playful disagreements that had always been a hallmark of the show. The chemistry that had made The View work for so long felt strained. Viewers noticed. Social media comments on subsequent episodes kept coming back to the Julia incident, saying the show felt different now, that something had broken, that couldn't easily be fixed. Some praised this new tension as making the show more authentic, less scripted. Others said it made the show uncomfortable to watch, that they missed when disagreements felt good-natured rather than genuinely hostile. Julia herself remained relatively quiet on the matter. She didn't do a press tour explaining her side or attacking Joy. She posted once on social media a brief statement saying she believed in respectful dialogue even when people disagree, and that she hoped the conversation sparked by the incident would lead to more thoughtful discourse overall. It was classy, measured, and gave her critics nothing to grab onto. Joy, on the other hand, did several interviews about the incident. She remained adamant that she'd done nothing wrong, that her questions had been fair, and that Julia's reaction had been disproportionate. She seemed to view the entire controversy as validation of her point that celebrities can't handle real scrutiny. She showed no signs of reflection or reconsideration. This difference in their post-incident behavior became its own story. Many people who'd initially been on the fence found themselves siding more with Julia. Based on how each woman handled the aftermath, Julia's restraint was seen as dignified, while Joy's continued defensiveness was seen as stubborn or lacking self-awareness. What became clear as time passed was that this wasn't just about one interview gone wrong. It had become a lightning rod for larger conversations about media, celebrity, politics, and discourse. The incident became a case study, debated and referenced whenever people discussed how we communicate, especially when we disagree. In the end, what the Julia Roberts interview proved was something many people already suspected but didn't often see demonstrated so clearly on live television: that respect and challenge aren't mutually exclusive, that you can ask difficult questions without being hostile, that standing up for yourself isn't the same as being unable to handle criticism, and that sometimes walking away is the most powerful statement you can make. So what do you think? Was Joy right to push as hard as she did, or did she cross a line? Was Julia justified in walking off, or should she have stayed and fought back? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next video.